Well, it was fairly clear that the big storm of April 1856 was as big as they come. The Great Storm of April 1856, there was no early warning system for that. People could only go out and look at the sky and see what was happening. And there's some great descriptions of it that are in the accounts afterwards. But boy, it was a big storm that just all of a sudden came on and boom, wreaked havoc on this community.
164 years ago, on April 12, 1856, a massive tornado struck Alliance, Ohio, and all neighboring communities. It continued on, only burning itself out on the shores of the Atlantic.
Life in Alliance here in the 1850s was still kind of a frontier town kind of feel.
It was a very different time back then. You have to remember that Alliance was a very new community. It was made up of 3 smaller communities, Williamsport on the north side of the Mahoning River, we had Freedom on the south side of the Mahoning River, and then a little community that was springing up right around the crossroads of the railroads on the east end of Main Street, and that was called Liberty.
Williamsport and Freedom already existed as villages, but they were very, very small, and Alliance itself wasn't that big. It went from a few hundred to about 2,000 by 1860. So it grew fairly fast, but it was also growing fairly rough. One of the best indicators is that when Abraham Lincoln came and stopped at the railroad station in 1861 on his way to his inauguration, the Salem newspaper listed Alliance, Ohio, described it as a city of mud. Well, it was. All the roads were dirt roads, and the houses and buildings were primarily, frame houses made out of wood. There was a few brick buildings, but that was still, another decade or two in the future. So it was still kind of a rough and tumble place.
In 1856, Alliance was a very, very new community. It was just barely off the ground, and times were tough back then.
Communication in the 1850s was going through a mass media revolution, okay, but still mostly you got your news by word of mouth through letters. But the things that were changing at the time were newspapers that were still generally 4 pages long and printed once a week. And mostly of those 4 pages, there was about a half page that was constituted as local news.
In the April 16th edition of the Malign Workman in Malign, Illinois, almost 500 miles from Alliance, Ohio, the meteorological table remarked that on April 11th, they had south winds, cloudy, and thunderstorm. And on the 12th, the weather was windy, cloudy, rain, and most ominously, sudden change. Earlier that year, Illinois paper advertised 10,000 acres of choice land for sale on liberal terms and lots to suit. B. Barr, the city undertaker, advertised that he, quote, keeps constantly on hand coffins of every quality and size. Also for sale in the newspaper were heavy castor beaver for overcoats, hats and caps of plush wool, fur or black silk, and, quote, and many other kinds of ready-made clothing, too numerous to mention in this list, end quote. Books advertised included, quote, Lives of Atrocious Judges, Memoirs of Catherine, the Empress of Russia, Henry VIII and His Six Wives, Border Wars of the West, and My Bondage and My Freedom by Frederick Douglass, which cost $1.20. An American ship reported as, quote, probably the Chatworth of New York, previously reported as completely equipped for the slave trade, had been destroyed by a British cruiser, end quote. The winter of 1855 into 1856 is reported to be the coldest winter of the 1850s, and one of the coldest ever from 1780 to 1865, according to the long, hard winter of 1855 to 56 by Donald Sutherland. September of 1855 saw torrential rainstorms that swept the Atlantic region, and snow began to accumulate by early October. The severe weather continued through winter. During a blizzard in the January of 1856, the New York Daily Times described the city writing, quote, everybody loves what a carnival there is here when the sleighing is good. It was a capital day yesterday, providing only the teams were strong enough. And the riders piled onto the public sleighs by scores and hundreds. Over 100 we counted in several of the carryalls, with only 4 poor steaming wrecks of horses to drag them through. The riders were very merry and some of them drunk. They sang and yelled and roared all sorts of tunes. As late as March 31st, the Mid-Atlantic and southern states were still having extreme snowfall. Snowfall then gave way to the rains. Reports from Chicago stated that the weather was, quote, subjected to a sudden change, and, quote, by afternoon it had become one of the most bitter and violent gales which ever visit us during the navigable season, end quote. After blowing through Chicago at lunchtime, the storm continued east. It was now 345 miles from Alliance. Between 5 and 5:30 the evening of the 12th, a tornado 200 to 300 yards wide swept through parts of Congress and Milton Township in Wayne County, Ohio. The Worcester Republic reported, quote, prevailed with terrible violence. Forests and orchards were destroyed, as well as the roofs of nearly every barn in that area. Several houses were destroyed as well. The writing staff said it was, quote, decidedly the most angry-looking cloud we ever saw approaching, end quote. In that area, Amos Kessler's house burnt to the ground when his chimney or stovepipe blew over and started a blaze. His family barely escaped with their lives, and one bed. Everything else was lost to the storm and fire. As the storm moved into Stark County townships, the destruction continued. Reports stated that buildings left undamaged were the exception. An elderly woman in Plain or Jackson Township was struck by a piece of fence and injured badly. When the tornado struck Lake Township near Uniontown, a young man whose headstone stated he was 29 years, 9 months, and 22 days old at the time of his death was killed. Andrew Bridenstine was riding his horse through the woods when he was struck by a tree limb in the back of his head, breaking his neck. At approximately 6 p.m., the United Brethren Church at the corner of modern-day Beach Street and Beechwood Avenue lost its steeple and bell. The bell was recovered later undamaged, but a small brick house standing near the church was unroofed. The tornado roared into Mount Union and Alliance. It was later described in unbelievable detail. Quote, the day had been an extremely warm one for April. The sun shone from a flecked sky at intervals, and the temperature rose to 80 degrees. A light south wind blew during the day, but it was scarcely a breeze. The winds were stilled by the sultry, scorching heat. About 2:30 in the afternoon, portentous clouds were seen in the west. These advanced rapidly. There appeared to be two distinct clouds of inky blackness, and between these two was a cloud area of yellowish hue, and across this darted the lightning and swift scuttling clouds of intense blackness. Pearls of thunder in the distance became more distant as the storm clouds neared. The breeze gave place to a perfect calm, and the heat of the afternoon became oppressive. Yellow-topped thunderclouds boiled and seethed above the blue-black storms of clouds that hung as a shroud below them. Thousands of people watched the unusual phenomenon as the storm advanced. The roar of the winds was distinctly heard to the west, and in the clouds could be seen branches of trees swirling high above the earth. A moment, and they were lost in the cloud. The first blast came from the northwest, and these were furious. Trees bowed to the decree of the winds and were snapped in twain or uprooted. Fences were swept away at the sport of the winds and scattered in every direction. The storm was upon us. In the blackness of the hour, vivid flashes of lightning lit up with a lurid glare, and the scene, but the roar of the tornado was louder than the peals of thunder. The whole earth appeared to be hung with blackness and darkness. This was but a few minutes, and light appeared, and then the second burst of the furies came from the southwest, with more fury than the blast from the northwest. Rain fell in torrents for a few moments, and then all was over, and the sun streamed from a clear sky, and the calm returned.
To have such a large tragedy so shortly after the founding of the community, it was really difficult.
So their response was, I think what they had already been, these were in fact the pioneers of, Northeast Ohio too. It was like, okay, this happened, and we moved on because there wasn't a lot of warning. It just all of a sudden happened. They had a beautiful day that day, right? And then this terrible destruction.
It's estimated that 50 buildings were severely damaged or destroyed in those brief minutes. There were 3 deaths in Alliance and 1 in Damascus. The most descriptive of the deaths involved Isaac Johnson. Isaac's family had moved to the Alliance area 1 generation prior to his birth. His grandfather, Daniel Johnson, and great-grandfather, Captain Joseph Mendenhall, the fighting Quaker, who ended their days in Fayette County, Pennsylvania, had both served in the American Revolution. Isaac lived across from his father, Joseph Johnson, near the modern-day intersection of Beeson Street and Sawbridge Avenue in Alliance, Ohio. On the morning of April 12th, after a crushingly cold winter, Alliance residents woke up to an 80-degree day. No doubt because of the beautiful spring day, Isaac and his wife, Catherine, rode into town with their team of horses. They were shopping in E. Teeters and Company's store when Isaac noticed the approaching storm. Probably in fear that his team of horses would be scared off by the storm, he went outside to calm them. The fierce winds rushed across the frontier landscape in comparatively minuscule structures. When they reached the vicinity of E. Teeter's store, the crushing force winds caused Isaac to be, quote, killed by the brick wall falling upon him. He was horribly crushed. Mr. Johnson was about 30 years of age. Mr. Johnson's mother was so affected on beholding the corpse of her son that she fell in an apoplectic fit and soon expired. End quote. Also included in the damage was the Methodist Church in Mount Union, which was unroofed. The American House lost part of its roof and all its windows. The Baptist Church on North Arch Street, which had been blown down the year before by wind and was in a state of reconstruction, was now, quote, a total wreck, end quote. The Alliance Exchange, a 3-story brick hotel, was, quote, dismantled. A large frame building being constructed by Mr. Hoover and Mr. Hanna was, quote, razed to the ground, end quote. Builders who were working on the building when the tornado struck were buried in the falling timber and had to be, quote, extricated with some difficulty, end quote. They were all injured, but not fatally so. E. Teeters lost another building, a warehouse along the Ohio and Pennsylvania Railroad. Sunset on April 12, 1856 would have come at 7:04 p.m. As darkness fell, the storm continued east, causing significant damage in New Chambersburg in Columbiana County, Ohio, Damascus, Ohio, and Salem, Ohio. Those affected by the storm began surveying the damage seconds after it passed. Others continued their duties as they could, including the movement of railroad traffic traveling north and east out of Alliance. Conductor Russell inched his engine up the tracks to the north of Alliance. He stopped to remove 17 trees that had fallen across the tracks and continued to avoid trouble until his, quote, locomotive struck an oak tree 2 feet in diameter, cutting entirely through it, end quote. Russell's accident occurred about 1.5 miles north of the city and disabled his engine by throwing it from the tracks. A coal train following close behind was able to move the passenger train back to Alliance, where it was given a new engine. It made Cleveland, quote, 5:30 on Sunday morning, 8 hours behind time, end quote. Daniel Howell Hayes of Salem, Ohio, was visiting Ridgway Haynes at what is now the Haynes House Museum in Alliance, Ohio, when the storm came on. He described seeing homes demolished and unroofed. He had already boarded his train to return to Salem as the tornado blew through town. Hayes stated that because of the trees across the tracks, it took his train 5 hours to travel from Alliance to Salem.
Trees particularly, this is one of those things that kind of reminds me of, we had microburst storms, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, that really you could tell tons of trees just like went away because they had been blown down by the storm.
The following morning, Hayes explained the, quote, storm is much worse than anticipated. About all the good timber in the neighborhood is blown down. All of mine that is very valuable is down, end quote. Hayes further describes that, like Alliance, Salem had many homes and barns destroyed or damaged. One farmer, Israel Barber, fared the worst, Hayes explained, because at the time of the storm's arrival, Barber was boiling maple syrup. Timbers from his barn blew into the flames of the boil and caused him to lose his barn, grain, and horses, all consumed by the fire. As the storm flung Alliance and her fellow towns behind it, it ravaged on across Pennsylvania, damaging Old Enon, Pennsylvania, on the border with Ohio. It carried on, causing a bridge to collapse into the Allegheny River at Kittanning, Pennsylvania. Much like some of the buildings in Alliance, the bridge was recently completed when the storm hit, tearing the bridge from its stone foundations and throwing it and a one-armed toll collector into the swollen river. The toll collector was later recovered downstream, clinging to life and debris. As with the Brethren Church near Alliance, Kittanning St. Paul's Church lost its bell tower. This was the second time St. Paul's had been hit by a tornado. Several other buildings and churches were destroyed in Kittanning. The next reports of the storm come from Philadelphia, which mentions damage throughout the city, but most especially in the northwest region of Philadelphia. The storm struck about 10 p.m. 224 homes were reported to be damaged and 5 destroyed. A dye house, boiler manufacturer, stables, whiting manufactory, and a slaughterhouse all destroyed, and many others severely damaged. Amazingly, only one death was reported from Philadelphia. A woman attempting to close the blinds was struck in the head by a shutter and killed. The New York Evening Post wrote, quote, an innumerable number of dwellings and barns have been unroofed in every direction, end quote. The storm then blazed its last on the shores of the Atlantic just as a new day began at midnight. 1856 and the people carried on. Woodrow Wilson was born, who, during his presidency, would oversee another great tragedy when the Great Lakes hurricane struck in 1913, killing 250 people and destroying 19 ships. The, quote, November gale, end quote, was a blizzard with hurricane-force winds of over 90 miles per hour and 35-foot waves. Many of those killed were from Ohio. The great bell that hangs in the Big Ben Tower was cast in 1856. Out in Kansas, John Brown enjoyed a victory at the Battle of Blackjack. Dr. John Veitch discovered borax, and Cyrus Chambers Jr. patented a folding machine for books and newspapers. In the U.S. Senate, Charles Sumner was beaten by the senator from South Carolina with a cane for expressing abolitionist views. Sumner nearly died, and the event was considered, quote, the breakdown of reasonable discourse, end quote, which led to the use of violence to settle the issue, the American Civil War. In Alliance, J.T. Wybrick established the first lumber yard in Alliance.
J.T. Wybrick started his lumber yard that same year because I think he would have had a lot of work rebuilding some of the roofs that were taken off from the tornado.
Coming together, depending on your neighbor, working together in order to make things better, that's what happened.
The tornado, I think it's a little more difficult to assess because people were used to a hard life back then. They were farmers, they were struggling to make a life, and they were used to hardship, and they just soldiered through, and they would pick up. They might have to go over and help their neighbor, but the neighbor would come and help them as well. So in those days, they expected life to be hard, and they carried on.
The tornado of 1856 went as quickly as it came, here and gone in a moment. Some lost their lives or fortunes, but all in its path carried the memories of that day forever.